All right, Dr. Lisle, how are you doing today?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. It's getting a little cold, and I'm down here in Southern California, so for us, like freezing weather is like 50 degrees. You know.
Yeah, you're really suffering down there. Yeah,
Yeah, I
I,
always
I,
I,
I
I
could
used to. Yeah.
go ahead. Hello?
Oh, yeah, I always I never really quite realized like what cold actually meant until I was living up in Northern California, where you near where you are, and now I know.
Oh my God, you have no. Anybody that happens to be listening from Boston now is just rolling their eyes at you. That is a naive young human. All right.
Yeah. All
All
right.
right. Well,
Well,
what do
well,
we got going?
today's show we're going to be continuing a little bit more on willpower and change. Now,
Hmm.
last week, I just want to tell you, what you said about how to change something. It really struck a chord with me because I'm constantly trying to change things in my life for the better and improve here and there. And whether it's misguided or not, I always wondering why. Like, how does that happen? How does change come about? And how you said that basically change doesn't happen unless we have new information, and then we have a path where where we might see that it's possible to change. That was really, really, really revolutionary to me.
Good. Yeah. And so what that does is that literally changes your brain, and that gives you new information about change itself, and that can then influence your ability to change. As strange as that is, it's a little recursive situation going on there, but it's absolutely true. This is why uh, I will submit that it is my belief that human beings don't have any choice as to what they think, and they don't have any choice as to what they do. But what happens is that they are in fact designed to learn, and so by learning, the brains can actually become more effective and more efficient at what it is that they do. In essence, more accurate. And so, with better information inside your head, your brain becomes a better problem solver, and you triangulate more accurately towards the truth. And the truth is an accurate identification of reality. And as you have a more accurate identification of reality, you are likely to be much more effective in your behavior in pursuit of what your goals are. So it's this is how it is that you can essentially see an entire class of organisms, a whole species, our own, improving in its behavior. This is not something that you're going to see in the animal kingdom. You're seeing human beings over the centuries making radical improvements in their behavior as they individually and collectively become much more intelligent. Their IQs aren't any higher, but their effective IQs are a great deal higher because they are accurately identifying the nature of nature, and therefore they are making less and less mistakes and wasting less time and energy by doing things in a more effective manner. So when you figure out that you can have an internal combustion engine instead of having an ox, you have correctly identified the nature of nature, and you are utilizing that discovery to aid and abet your existence. And so the march of human progress is astounding, particularly in the last 200 years, as human beings have become increasingly effective because they understand reality more accurately. And so the same thing is true. What is true for human beings collectively is also true for them individually. So the more accurate your brain is at understanding reality, the less and less mistakes you make. And what a mistake is ultimately essentially an unnecessary waste of time and energy. That's what a mistake is. And so there are mistakes. You could call things mistakes that are essentially necessary errors in the system where you've hit a constraint on the organism's ability to do things accurately. Like, for example, a great example would be shooting a basketball. So there is an identified technique for shooting a basketball that is optimal for the nature of how a human being is architecturally designed. and that is the one-hand shot. Okay, so 80 years ago, nobody shot with one hand, but a young guy named Hank Luisetti at Stanford figured this out, and I think there was another guy too. So there's maybe some historical debate over who gets credit, but Luisetti was the most widely known player that used this technique, and it was a superior technique. And everybody else thought that the proper way to shoot a basketball was with two hands. And it turns out that is not the proper way to shoot a basketball, because even though they'd done it that way exclusively for 50 or 60 years, it was an inaccurate hypothesis that was the best way to shoot a basketball. The problem is that to shoot a basketball straight with two hands, you have to have extraordinary bilateral coordination with both arms pushing the ball equally hard in order to get it to go straight. Whereas if you just have one arm pushing the ball, you don't have that problem. And so you massively reduce you reduce the source of massive variance in that problem, and you wind up with a much, much more efficient method for putting a basketball in a hoop. That is an example of an ineffective strategy for doing something, then getting corrected. And now, of course, the whole world that plays basketball, that's all they do is shoot with one hand. So the players of today are infinitely superior in terms of their shooting abilities to the players in the 1930s or 40s. It's also true, and we could talk about that in all kinds of sports. So the sports are constantly evolving as people figure out better ways to do things. In the same way that you see this happening on a societal level, you could do it in your own life. So what we're attempting to do here is to walk away from the essentially unconscious demands and script that is put into you by the genetic code that tells you to do things in a way that optimize gene survival that don't not necessarily cause you to optimize your happiness. That's why we call this podcast Beat Your Genes. We're looking at it as essentially like a game of solitaire, where we're trying to figure out how to make all the right moves to activate the moods of happiness most efficiently, so that you use your time and energy on Earth in ways to optimize your life experience. That's, as far as I'm concerned, that's the game of life and how we want to play it. There's many nuances to that, and there's so many different sort of targets and goals that would be part of human life, but we see as we look inside of those that those targets and goals are remarkably uniform around the world, because human nature is human nature. And in the same way that aardvarks have things that aardvarks like, and the same way that killer whales have things that killer whales like, human beings have things that human beings like. And so human beings all have extremely similar goals, and they are competing with each other for esteem, being in mates, friends, and trading partners. Those are the main goals of the system, and those are the main sources of potential happiness. And what we want to watch out for is letting the system essentially run unconsciously in a way that it optimizes our gene survival but doesn't optimize our happiness. When we talk about change last time, we're now going to one of the things that we see is we see a puzzling tendency for people to have a goal where they would like to do something better, but they aren't doing it. And they can't understand why it is that they can't manage to make a change. And the reason why that is that their mind's design is to run a cost-benefit analysis on all available alternatives, and to essentially come up with what it believes is the most efficient use of its time and energy in pursuit of survival and reproductive success. That's what it's doing. And so until something changes in that cost-benefit analysis, the behavior is not going to change. So I talked about last time, for people that didn't listen to this and find this little discussion interesting, last time I talked about how the organism is designed to run extraordinarily complicated cost-benefit analysis, as we started with a single example of an organism with a single sense organ for example, temperature preference, and then we added sight, sound, hearing, et cetera. And pretty soon you have an organism that has extraordinarily complex sensory inputs, and that all these sensory inputs need to be calibrated against each other as they are able to rate and calculate the survival and reproductive benefits and threats of different sensory inputs. So if you're a rabbit, for example, you have 3 hungry little rabbit pups in your lair under the ground, and you are hungry, and you can tell that you are near possible starvation or a point where you're going to get pretty weak. You have to run the cost-benefit analysis of going and digging for the carrots against the fact that in your observation there's an awful lot of foxes around in the environment right now. And so your job is to actually run a cost-benefit analysis of the opportunities in the environment versus the threats, and come up with the right answer. And what you have inside your head is if you're a rabbit, is you have a universal value calibrator or a value computational system that actually does those computations for you automatically. They're extremely complicated. They're so complicated that the 20th century in psychology largely didn't even consider that was possible. And so they essentially suffered from a massive blindness to what it is that they were observing in animal behavior. They didn't do a lot of observing of animal behavior. Those were left to sort of other kinds of people, but they certainly missed it when it came to human behavior. So the 20th century psychology academic psychology suffered from what we're going to call a massive instinct blindness, that they did not understand the subtlety and magnitude of these extraordinary computations that are happening automatically inside the mind in order to arrive at an optimal cost-benefit analysis, or what I should say, it's an optimal analysis, but it may not be the right answer. So it's the equivalent of a great poker player who actually computes the correct odds on whether or not he should bet or he should fold, and he makes a move based on the correct computation, but he loses everything, okay, because that was just the nature of that game. So animals make the right moves according to the innate value system that is built into their genetic code, and so do we, but that doesn't mean that we have optimal outcomes. And so that's the game of life that we are set with. Your behavior human behavior tends to be quite stable to the extent that their relationship to the environment is stable. So, for example, let's suppose we have somebody that's not very happy on their job, and they're not very happy with their boss, and they're not very happy with their coworkers, and so what they are is that they're for 8 or 9 hours a day, they're not very happy. And so they would like to be happier. And part of them would like to just have things different. Maybe one hope for things changing might be a management consultant that's going to come in supposedly early next year and talk about how to make the team work together better. Good luck with all that. Yeah. So the truth of the matter is that individual's relationship to their social environment is, for whatever reasons, there's problematic. There's conflicts of interest there, and we could do a little ad hoc calculus and probably find out a lot of the solution to the problem of what it is that they're facing. So when a person comes into me, for example, and they're complaining about their situation at work, and then I talk to them further, and they start explaining to me how every previous situation that they've ever worked in has been unfair and ridiculous and exploitative and everything else. And then I hear about their relationships, and they're unfair and exploitative and disgusting, and then I hear about, et cetera.
He thinks there's a common denominator there.
We start figuring out what the problem is that we've got a brain that runs cost-benefit analyses from a skewed perspective and winds up feeling like the world is treating the individual unfairly. Okay, so that's what's happening. So I know where the general locus of the problem is, that it's in the individual's nervous system as opposed to in a particularly unfortunate environmental circumstances. However, if I have a different situation where I have a really sweet person and I can tell that person is perfectly agreeable and that now, in fact, things were wonderful at their work until 2 years ago when they got a new boss that came in from the outside or was promoted or some such thing, and he's just this nightmare to deal with. So now we have a situation where the person is doing a tremendous amount of unnecessary suffering because of something that could be changed. And so we look at this and we're trying to figure out, how is it that we're going to get the person to change, and they may have a number of reasons why it is that they are not doing anything about this, and those are the things that we pick apart one by one to try to essentially disillusion their mind as to the cost-benefit of making changes. So changes will take place only under circumstances where there's new information that's coming into the brain. That new information could happen literally because we change the sensory input from the situation. So, for example, the rabbit is heading out into the wild to get some carrots, and it is determined that it's going to take a risk of going to get those carrots, even in the face of this potential foxes. And it's a time of day when it's seen a lot of foxes where it's been dissuaded before. But now its circumstances change, and it goes outside and there aren't any foxes. And in fact, it may hear of a bunch of foxes squealing a death squeal from hundreds of yards away, and it feels like, good, whatever the big predators are, they're all busy. So we've now changed the sensory input on the system when we change the computations. People will notice that one of the best things that you can do if you're all twisted up about some kind of a problem is to change your location. Go somewhere that is very soothing in terms of the senses and very different, and just change it up. People will notice, for example, that they can be very harried at their workplace and very stressed to get out of town, but once they get out of town, even within less than an hour, they can find themselves starting to relax and getting a perspective on their life and on the life circumstances, and changing their mood as a result of just changing the sensory input. However, when it comes to changing a behavior pattern, what we want to do is several things that are useful. And that is sometimes changing any variable in the equation at all in order to shake things up so that you see things from a somewhat different perspective. This is the equivalent of, if you're stuck on a jigsaw puzzle, one of the things that you want to do is to just scramble the remaining pieces around and just move them around. You've been staring at them too long and you can't see a solution, so sometimes what you need to do is stir. I've had people that are stuck and can't get a job and are depressed and feel like it's not worthwhile to go to some, business mixer in Marin or whatever it is, that nothing's going to come of it. And I will tell them nothing may come of it, but nothing is going to come of it if you sit home. So we want to stir the pieces, and just, even if there isn't anything brilliant about any strategic change that we're making, literally banging around out in the universe will cause you to have possible new experiences that could be useful. So just getting even unstrategic experience where things have changed is a useful strategy. Incidentally, this appears to be a strategy that the brain uses in your dreaming. The brain is not asleep when you're asleep. It is still working on your problems, and it's still attempting to organize solutions and run cost-benefit analysis in order to try to aid and abet your decision-making when you're awake. And it appears to be the case that when you are dreaming, there are highly regular blasts of acetylcholine that are put into the brain in order to apparently disrupt and jumble up the fragments of your thinking, in order to possibly result in a radical reorganization that you might not ever have happen in waking. And this is very much equivalent to scrambling around the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle in a way to possibly see things reorganized from a new perspective. Very many solutions to many people's problems have come in their dreaming. and the dreaming tends to be chaotic in this way, with sort of bizarre juxtaposition of ideas, which is exactly what you would expect from a scramble like this. But what will also happen is you will occasionally have brilliant combinations of a potential idea, potential solution that you would have never come to when you were under a more logically oriented thinking process. Now, another thing is to get expert help. So there are people, almost any problem that anybody has ever faced in this world, somebody else has faced this problem before, and in these days, somebody is an expert in the problem. And so if you got a problem with a patent and you think you've got a great thing, but somebody is threatening to sue you, then go talk to a patent attorney. If you got a drain plug, talk to a plumber. And whatever the problem is that you're facing, it's a good idea to seek experts. And of course, your job is to get smart enough to cross-examine experts and don't open your wallet any too early or frivolously. In other words, be smart about experts, but don't just listen to one. If you're going to invest a significant amount of time and energy in trying to make some change, you may want to talk to 2 or 3 and see whether or not expert opinion will triangulate towards a direction that makes a lot of sense. I would say another thing that will get people stuck and keep them stuck in situations that they really would like to change is going to be supernormal stimuli. So supernormal stimuli are drugs, food, the electric light bulb, pornography, even music, etc. Things of this nature. Facebook is supernormal stimulation. When you hyper concentrate stimuli in a way and process the stimulation in a way that was never done in the Stone Age, and you then transfer that information to these sensory organs, what's going to happen is that you can essentially get experiences and cost-benefit analyses being run that are distorted. And as a result, the brain will make systematic and repetitive errors, and it can be very, very difficult for the brain to correct those errors. So one of the smart things that we can do at times is to get out from under, literally consciously get ourselves out from under the supernormal stimuli, cancel it, ban it, whatever it is that it takes, and that sometimes can be a great way to affect change. There was a story told, before we go on, there was a story told by William Dement, who is one of the great researchers in sleep science at Stanford University. And Dement told a story of a friend of his who was a physician that would get burned out during the year, and then he would go camping for a couple of weeks, and he would get away from all the electric light, and he would catch up on his sleep, and he would hike, etc. And he said the guy would always come back just completely with a rebirth of his enthusiasm for medicine and his career and his life. And I read this, and I knew it was undoubtedly true. And I thought it was a great story, and I'm glad Dr. Dement shared the story in his book. It's a very fine book called The Promise of Sleep. But of course, it left open the question: why are we having the problem? We clearly are seeing overwhelmingly that this guy's short of sleep and he's working too hard and he's staying up late, et cetera, and he's burning himself out. So why is this? He hasn't gotten to the root of figuring out how it is that he needs to organize his existence and change his environment so that he stops the problem. And so he doesn't need to get all burned out and then rediscover the beauty of having your mind and body re-regulated to an appropriate homeostasis and then wind up finding out how much better it feels. He could do it simply enough by making some changes in his own life. I had a question along these lines just today from a person that was asking in a forum that I was doing. And she said she's having trouble at work with making some positive dietary changes because the environment at work is so bad, and that I talk about how important the environment is. What is she supposed to do about this? And what I explained was sometimes the environmental change, we don't have to be passive recipients of the environment. We can change the environment ourselves. And so I explained that she needs to put out time and energy to actually have really good, exciting, and interesting healthy food options that she brings to work. And so therefore, that's how she changes her environment at work, and in order to have those sensory inputs competing with the supernormal inputs that are, that are not in her best interest, in her best health interest, and weight loss interest. Essentially, that's how you can change your own environment and make your environment more conducive to your positive behavioral change. All right, that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of stuff there, and so when people are starting to make their changes, you've talked about this before in some of your audio clips and videos. I read a book at your recommendation a couple of years ago by Roy Baumeister, and the book is called Willpower: Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. So I know that for me, if I'm trying to make a change, for instance, if I come home and I'm trying to stay away from Facebook and unhealthy food, I'm trying to get to the gym and like all the stuff that I'm trying to do, I get home and it's like I'm tired. I just don't want to do anything that I'm supposed to do. I just want to do the easy stuff. And reading this book about willpower kind of helped me understand a little bit about it. So yeah, can you take us through a little bit about willpower and kind of the lessons we've learned from Roy Baumeister, and then we'll take a phone call from from a listener who's calling in.
Sure.
After that.
Sure. The Baumeister's research, I think, is very interesting. It's come under some recent controversy as the effects are a little more tenuous than we might have expected after having read some of the synopses. I think there's a lot of promise in it, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. So let me give our listeners just a brief synopsis of the Baumeister paradigm, and explain what it is that he thought he found, and I believe he did find, but we're just going to find that it's not quite as powerful and universally potent as we might have thought at one time. The Baumeister paradigm looks like this. This was done in the 1990s, where for some reason people in Baumeister's laboratory came up with a very interesting experiment. And the experiment was to have people come into a room. These are going to be college students, and they will have been told to fast. So they're coming in hungry. And what they're going to do is they're going to be placed in front of a table, and on that table there's going to be a bowl of radishes, and there's going to be a plate of chocolate chip cookies with chocolate candy on it. And they will have just baked the cookies in a little oven right there in the laboratory. And the subject is going to draw a straw and find out which condition they're in. They're either going to be in the cookie condition or they're going to be in the radish condition. And it's ostensibly a study about taste preferences. And so, obviously, if you get the radish condition, you are really bummed out because you are to sit there and eat these radishes for about 10 minutes, and then the experiment will come back in, and then you'll fill out some forms, and that's that. Meanwhile, you would really like the chocolate chip cookies, and of course it feels unfair that somehow you wound up with the radish condition instead of the cookie condition. If you get the cooking condition, you're fine. You're just sitting there eating these cookies and trying to think about what you think about the taste of them and the quality or whatever. So this is all a setup, and for some reason Baumeister and his colleagues dreamed up that this was going to have an effect. I don't know why they thought so. They just did, and I think their intuition was fantastic. So let me tell you what they then discover. So after the people go through this process, and we know that the people in the radish condition were pretty stressed. We know this because they had hidden cameras where they were able to observe people picking up the cookies and sniffing them and everything. Nobody actually ate any of them, but they were very, stressed out about wanting to eat them. So after the experimenter came back in, they gave them their credit, thank you, and they sent them down the hallway to a second study, and a study was on geometric intelligence. So these two studies look unbelievably unrelated to each other. So the subjects would have had no idea that these two things were related. Nothing could be much different from each other than taste preference study versus a study of geometric intelligence. So as they come in the laboratory, they're met by a completely different person, and they say, this is a study of geometric intelligence, or something like this. I don't remember the exact cover story, but it's very close to this. and they're told, okay, here are these geometric figures, and these geometric figures are they're complicated, but you can draw them without lifting your pencil. And so we're going to give you a stack of paper here, and your job is to figure out how to redraw these things and reproduce them without lifting your pencil from the paper. And we're really timing this to see how fast people can do them. And so I'm going to leave you alone. I'm going to be out in the hallway. When you're done, just ring this bell, and then I'll come back in, and then you'll show me how it is that you did it. Oh, by the way, of course, some people can't manage to do it, a few people. So, i.e., if you're an idiot and you can't figure this out, then just, when you've decided that you can't solve the problem, ring the bell and I'll come back in. Now, Baumeister had the following intuition. And his intuition was that the people that were in the cookie condition in the first part of the study would not have been stressed. And so when they come back down to do this next study, they are going to look at this problem and they're going to work at it and they're going to work at it and they're going to work at it. And then finally, they're going to come to the conclusion that they can't solve it. And eventually, they're going to pick up that little bell and ring the bell. And it is what it is. And he had no idea how long that might be. It turned out to be about 20 minutes that the average subject would go. But he believed that the people in the radish condition would have been stressed out by wanting to eat the chocolate chip cookies but not eating them. And that when they would go down the hallway to the new study, that when we put them in a new stressful condition where they couldn't figure out how to do this drawing, that they would quit sooner. And so it was a very interesting idea that there was sort of a limited bank account inside the head of how much stress it could put up with before it would just quit. And it turned out that the effect was beautiful, that the average length of time that the people in the radish condition would work on these figure drawings was about 8 minutes. So the difference between 8 minutes and 20 minutes was staggering. And in fact, it turned out that there wasn't a single person in the chocolate chip cookie condition that went for a shorter time than anybody in the radish condition. In other words, it was a perfect distinction between the two groups. Now, as time passed, more experiments were done. And what Baumeister was able to surmise from a number of studies was that effectively this sort of guts to continue on and persevere had a great deal to do with the amount of glucose that's in a specific area of the brain that's attempting to work on that decision. And so it looks like what happens is when you're trying to sitting there and deciding for 10 minutes whether you should steal a cookie or not steal a cookie, and you would really like to steal a cookie but you can't do it, and you have to keep going back and forth in your own mind, that effectively tires out the system by burning through the available glucose in that particular area of the brain. Not the whole brain, but an area of the brain that's involved in sort of integrating decisions and looking for mistakes is what it appears to be related to. And so when they go down to the other study where they're supposed to do the figure drawings, they are already fatigued. And essentially the system is, this is what Baumeister would eventually label, he would call it ego depletion. And ego is supposedly sort of the reasoning side of the brain that is figuring out how you should be doing things or what you should be doing, and then the ego sort of gives up and just quits. And this became known as ego depletion, and it wouldn't be until after he actually named it that it would come to light that it looked like this glucose in the glucose concentration in a specific area of the brain was related to this. Now, other investigators have poked and prodded and had disagreements and have had difficulty showing the effect in a number of situations. However, there are many experiments where the effect has been found to be striking, and so I'm not sure why we're seeing some of the confusion, and we've got more to learn about the situation. But in an extraordinary study that was it was an archival study, which means they didn't run a study. They went into the file drawers to actually look at statistics of a past set of decisions that had been made by a parole board in Israel. And this parole board, the people on the parole board had a great deal of experience in making decisions about whether or not people should be sent home. And so the notion was that these people considered all these various and sundry factors, and they were judges and attorneys and psychiatrists and correctional officers. And so they're really analyzing the daylights of whether or not somebody should be let home or not. Well, the average number of people that they would let home in front of this Israeli parole board in a given year was about 35%. And so if you were to collapse those decisions across a day, take 1,000 decisions and collapse them across the hours of a day, in principle, you should expect no difference in the outcomes of cases that are heard at 8 o'clock versus people's that are heard at 4:30 in the afternoon. If you have listened to this, you start to suspect the possibility that maybe the justice is not being done uniformly. That line, if you were to draw a graph on the rate of given parole, that graph should be absolutely horizontal. It should be 35% at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, then lunchtime, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. It should be absolutely flat as those years' data are compiled. The reason it should be flat is because the case factors don't vary by day, so they don't hear the axe murders at 9 a.m. and hear the parking tickets at 5. In other words, the case factors are randomized, obviously, throughout the year. Nobody knows what an 11 a.m. case is going to look like till you see it, and over the course of a year, those case factors are even, plenty even with respect to an 11 a.m. case as opposed to a 2 p.m. case. So it turns out that in an extraordinary finding, that the first case of the day, the odds of going home are about 70%. If your case is heard a little later on in the morning, before the judges go on break, your odds of going home are about 10 or 15%. If your case is heard after the judges come back from break, your odds are about 70%. If your case is heard right before lunch, your odds are about 10%. If your case is heard after lunch, your odds are about 70%. In other words, it's not even remotely close. The odds of going home can be a factor of 7 difference, depending upon what time of day it is that this is being heard. So despite some challenges to the Baumeister paradigm that have come to light recently, and Baumeister himself is puzzled and kind of upset about it, and he's going back to the lab himself, and he's going to try to work out, try to understand some anomalies that have not been explained. But when I saw the Israeli study, I was astounded by the evidence. Right there in our face, we see what happens to the mind when we fatigue the mind, and therefore it becomes impulsive. And it's a very impulsive thing for judges to just, when they're tired, to just say, just keep them in. We know that that's a much easier decision than a much more carefully nuanced decision about whether or not a person deserves to leave. So at any rate, this is useful for us because we can now see that the old message from Alcoholics Anonymous called HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. This is sort of this lay analysis of some things that people have seen in working with addiction, that when people get hungry, they're more impulsive. When they're more emotional, they're going to likely be more impulsive. And when they're fatigued, they're more likely to be impulsive. And this is going to be true, and so it's useful for us to know that when you are sort of overwhelmed and you can't muster up the energy to do the right thing, it's likely to be that you're fatigued. And so I will tell couples that see me that are struggling with their relationship that they should, at the end of their day, they should not even have any discussions about any kind of problem solving, about anything that's the slightest bit contentious, until they've eaten. Okay, they need to get some food in them and sort of recover from all the decisions that they've been making all day long, because they're basically like a couple of judges that are at the end, that are on their last leg. So that's some things to know about your own psychology when it comes to trying to make behavioral changes, you should recognize that you are making these changes within the backdrop of a brain that's ability to hang on to a wise behavior pattern is fluctuating depending upon its own essentially glucose reserves and its own its stress tolerance by virtue of its fatigue. So I will tell people that there's a few useful strategies to help combat this sort of ego depletion or fatigue factor when it comes to willpower. Number one is try to invest in the process of having your own home situation and your work situation very orderly. It turns out if you're very orderly and very organized, then your mind has to work less hard at determining what priorities it should be dealing with. And as a result, life actually gets easier. So life gets easier and easier the more and more organized you become. And so that's a useful strategy for changing your existence for the better. Another thing is to have plenty of healthy food that is around and available for you. The most useful food is likely going to be things like complex carbohydrates, rice, beans, potatoes, corn, wheat, oats, that sort of thing. That what we want to do is we want to have bananas. We want to have food stuff that's healthy that can actually carry us through periods of intense concentration that might last for 2 or 3 hours. That's a good thing to essentially build our diet around, that sort of material. And then finally, we want to do a couple other things. Regular modest exercise is good for essentially all kinds of bodily functions, particularly probably the kicking out or the ability of the liver to mobilize glycogen under stress is probably improves with exercise, which may be the reason why when people start exercising, it actually improves their willpower. And finally, we want people to get to sleep because shortage of sleep is going to compromise the mind's ability to do complex analysis and be willing to stand up to the stresses of that. So these are 4 rather simple prescriptions for supporting your willpower as you try to go about the process of making positive changes.
All right. Well, we had thank you very much. That's a lot of useful information. We had a caller who was on hold for a little bit. It looks like they hung up. So if you want to call back, caller, please give us a call back. I know we ran a little bit, 10, 15 minutes on hold, but we will take you right away. But until then, we've got a question from one of our listeners regarding making some changes in her life. So here we go. Okay. So here, dear Dr. Lisle, my problem is my boyfriend and I are 30 years old, no children. We've been together for 9 years, and we live in Central Europe. A couple of months ago, my boyfriend got a job in a foreign country, and it was an offer we just couldn't refuse. So we moved, and we have been living in Switzerland now for 2 months. I don't speak the language, don't really know the culture. I don't have any friends, relatives, or acquaintances here except for my boyfriend, and I don't have a job. I had problems with procrastination before the move. After I got a college degree and realized getting a job would be very difficult. But I haven't put things off to this extent. Now I put off learning the language, finding the job, meeting new people. I actually have a couple essays due from my previous arrangements in my native country, but I can't even finish those. It seems I might be missing a deadline, which has happened maybe once before in my life. I don't think I'm unhappy or depressed. I actually feel it was a good idea to move. But I do feel incredibly guilty lately because of my lack of work or involvement. I do all the housework, exercise, our relationship is still great. I do spend too much time playing video games and watching random TV series. Simply put, my lack of ambition or desire to make something of myself have risen to a whole other level, and I'm sure it will start to affect my personal growth in our relationship. I'd be really grateful for a couple of pointers or some help in this matter.
Fabulous. Great question. Seems very authentic. Here's what I would say. What we want to do when we see the problem is we want to look at this through the lens of the Stone Age mind. And so let's look at a few things. Right now she's not really unhappy because she's not in a hell of a lot of pain. The circumstances are good. This was an offer he couldn't refuse, so financially they're doing fine. So she doesn't have to worry so much about that. The relationship itself is pretty good. So as a result, that all seems like a secure enough situation for the interim. However, she's feeling guilty. Well, the reason she's feeling guilty is because things are not fair. He's going to work and he's working, and she's playing video games. And so the fact that he's not bitching about it yet is fine. In other words, it's telling that the relationship is currently strong enough that he's not furrowing his brow about this. But she's got enough conscientiousness naturally that she's running the alternative scenarios in her head, and she's coming up with the fact that she really needs to be contributing much more reasonably to their situation, and because she's not doing that, she's living on credit is effectively what's taking place. Now, there's reasons why that's taking place, and that is that she's in a new place, doesn't speak the language, may be difficult to get a job, etc. So she's being stymied in a way that would never happen in the Stone Age. In the Stone Age, there's no unemployment. If you're able-bodied at all, you wake up in the morning and there's 50 things that need to be done. There's no possible way that anybody, quote, can't find anything to do. There's food out there. There's roots to be dug. There's, worms to be dug for the fishermen. In other words, there's always something to do. In this case, we are so wealthy, and this person lives in such a benign set of circumstances that literally she can sit around and play video games, and yet there's no easy alternative for her to go out in the village and start to be helpful. Now, not particularly unhappy, just kind of guilty, etc. Now, our fundamental problem is that she hasn't solved the problem of how it is to get work. So that's a serious thing that's in front of us that we don't have solved. A thing that is crippling this and her things that she's not finishing up on is that she's in the thralls of a supernormal stimulus, which is video games. So video games are obviously designed to try to stoke mechanisms inside humans' heads that makes them think that they are being productive. So she's getting a pseudo productivity sensation in her head without actually being productive. And, of course, the more ingenious these people are about causing that pseudo experience, the more games they sell. Okay, and so people will join teams, and they'll have little dominance hierarchies and competitions that they work on, and so that all feels very, very productive. Whether or not she's playing those sorts of games or not, this is how elaborate this gets. A lot of the decision making that goes on in these video games is very carnal. Just as it would be in the Stone Age, they're actually going after circuits that are sitting in the Stone Age mind for, food and weapons and sort of coalition and risks and injuries, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, they're playing off the circuitry, so it feels inherently productive to be working those types of problems inside the system, et cetera. So she's in the throes of a supernormal stimuli that is it's kind of like a computer virus. It's effectively what it is. That the virus is in her head. It's taken up a bunch of space, and it's so compelling that she can't get herself switched over. So I would tell her that her goal would be to essentially shut down the video games just make a commitment to yourself. You're going to shut it down for the next 6 weeks. It's not like we're going to say we're never going to play a video game again. But you could just watch how difficult this is, and the fact that a person will go through psychological withdrawal. I mean, they're not going to be sick and throwing up, but they're going to be kind of disturbed and upset, and that's because they've been addicted to the supernormal stimuli of feeling like this was productive activity. We shut that thing down and we shut off that television. That human being does not need that supernormal stimulus. Now it gets real quiet. Okay, it gets real quiet. And now we start looking at the problem of this essay that's due. And if we can't turn on the TV and get supernormal stimuli, and we can't turn on a video game and get supernormal feedback that we're being productive, suddenly we've got to actually be productive. and we actually have to earn that feeling. And, of course, it's harder to earn that feeling than it is to get it in a pseudo fashion. And that's why people would much rather drink a chocolate shake than actually eat an apple. And that's because we can get an awful lot more stimulation out of the chocolate shake, and it takes almost no effort to chew it, whereas the apple actually requires a significant amount of effort to chew it, and it's less intense. So that's why the essay isn't done. That's why she's procrastinating and waiting for, some incremental evidence that not getting the thing done is going to be somehow costly, but nobody's rattling their saber at her or threatening her. And so she's likely to wait all the way until there's a tremendous threat, at which point she would do it in a half-ass fashion and throw it in at the end, getting away from the video games. But we can do better than that. We can recognize that the video games have got essentially a tractor beam on top of her motivational system, and that we need to chop them off completely, go cold turkey for the next 6 weeks. In the next 6 weeks, we're going to be facing the problem of how it is that we would learn to get a job in that foreign country. There are going to be people that may know this. There's going to be people to make contact with. We want to stir around and start getting some action on that. And at the end of 6 weeks, we will know a hell of a lot more than we do now about that problem. We may not have a job, and we may not have a solution to the job. But what we will have done is we'll have done some homework and put ourselves in a position where we are closer to the solution than we are now. So that I would also submit that when you have an educated person that would expect themselves to be able to get a job, and it would be expected in principle that they could get a job, that this person could be in the ego trap, where the expectations from the social environment and from their internal audience would be that they should be able to get a job, but now she's got some evidence that she may not be able to get one. So this puts you in the ego trap and essentially causes you to do self-destructive behavior so that both your internal audience and the external audience are observing that you really aren't trying, and maybe that's the reason you don't have a job. And so this is a contributing motivational force along with the supernormal issues associated with the video games and the television. Those, in addition, by the way, is also just general energy conservation programming that is running through this problem. But I would submit there's a very good chance that this person has a significant ego trap, self-destructive force that is taking place here, that she's essentially doesn't know where to start to get a job. It would seem that she should already know, or she should be that marketable. So therefore, if we don't try, the market hasn't rejected us, and we aren't looking quite as pathetic as if we really, really try and it turns out that we still can't find the market. So I would tell this person that, look, I don't know how I would find a job in Switzerland. I don't know how I would go about doing it, and I'm not sure that I could get one. But what we can do is we can make a task out of getting super educated. And our job is going to be to cover the groundwork so that we can pass on this information to the next person that comes behind us. So if we can find some way to increase our odds, that's information that's forever good for your village, and therefore the process can seem like it is worthwhile.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, I think that's going to be pretty tough, is not even to know the language. And she's been with her boyfriend for 9 years, and so it sounds like he may have known the language too. That's going to be a tough sell, right, for her?
Well,
the
truth is, in other words, you need to. If she is in the ego trap, then listen. We go back to the very same things that we were talking about earlier with respect to change. We're going to seek out expert help. Somebody else has been transferred to Switzerland. The people in Switzerland talk an awful lot of English. Okay, so I was just there a few months ago. So there's all kinds of English in Switzerland. The success leaves clues. There are going to be people who have faced this problem before. There's 6 million people in that country, and an awful lot of foreign traffic and travel and commerce is going on. And so as a result, her job is to sort of face the scary specter that she may go out there and start asking questions and nobody may know the answer and nobody may have a solution for her. That's a scary prospect. But let's go find out. Let's find out just how deep this water is rather than staying on the sideline and sort of letting life pass us by where we are sort of guilty and vaguely in trouble and we don't know how to solve it and we're just hoping that one way or the other fate changes the situation up and we're going to be rescued from this dilemma. We can be much more aggressive and proactive about how it is that we do this is if we get out of the ego trap and say, listen, we don't know what to do. Let's go get expert help. Let's go try the things that have the most rational possibility of success, and let's find out what we learn in the process. We may not get a job, but we are certain to know more 6 weeks from now about this situation than we do now. That I can guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
And furthermore, I can guarantee that her internal audience that may have the bar too high for her right now will readjust itself in the face of her sustained action in this regard as it watches her do her very best. And when she gets thwarted, if it turns out that the marketplace doesn't yield feedback, her internal audience will not be punishing to her. It will experience the disappointment that we can't easily solve this problem, but it will actually respect the fact that she's trying. And the same thing will be true of her boyfriend. Okay? Her boyfriend will not think less of her if she tries really hard and can't get a job. Okay? But part of her may be thinking that is true, and part of that she may be protecting her status with him and with anybody else in her life by holding back and allowing herself to indulge in this sort of this pseudo-productive process of the video games and TV and procrastination. So that's what I think that picture is, and we want to attack that problem by rolling up our shirt sleeves and daring for the situation to be lousy. And it may be a lousy situation. Let's go find out. And when we find out, we will have essentially removed distortions from our own mind about what we're up against. And the removal of distortion is always the path to better functioning.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I like this. Willpower and change is probably, coming up on the end of the year. Willpower and change is kind of one of the big things that everybody's trying to change. I was looking at an article about the top 15 things that people try to do, the New Year's resolutions. Mm-hmm. And I think almost all of them have something to do with willpower and change. Losing weight, better managing their finances, holding their tongue with annoying relatives, holding their tongue with their boss, all that stuff,
Sure. The relatives, they should just let it fly. That's fine.
You think so?
All right.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lisle. We really appreciate it. We'll look forward to having you back next week, and we'll come up with another topic.
Yes, and
any listeners?
Yep. Yeah, you tell your listener. Sorry about that. And next time, Nathan, we're neophytes at this. Next time, just interrupt me, and we will get to these people much more quickly, and just make sure we got our apologies there.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Not a problem. Caller, if you want to call back next week or anytime, we are live here on Wednesdays, 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. The number is 657-383-0751. And if you like the show, share it on social media, write a review on iTunes. We are now on Stitcher, and so we're on a couple of different platforms. So share it with your friends, share it with your family members. That way we get the word out. And if there's any people who want to email me with some questions for coming up episodes, or just go ahead and call in the middle of the show anytime, we will always take priority over the topic. So we will look forward to seeing you next week, Dr. Lisle. Thank you very, very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Nate.